Did you know there's a novel based on the underrated PlayStation 2 game Ico? It's called Ico Castle in the Mist, and is written by Miyuki Miyabe because of her appreciation for the game. It was released in Japan in 2004, but an English translation wouldn't arrive until 2010. And when I found out about the book a few years ago, I had to have it. Of course, this book is long out of print and somewhat difficult to find with very few listings online. It's not the cheapest book to buy, but also not the most expensive. While the novel isn't a replacement for the game, as I can say about any novel adaptation in this video, it does give insight into the characters and what they are thinking and saying. Because if you ever played Ico, you'll know it's more of a game about actions than words, and I would still recommend playing the game first and then reading Castle in the Mist. It was this book that inspired me to dive into the deeper world of PlayStation novels and comics. Many of these PlayStation games that we all know and love have these expanded universes that are just waiting to be dived into. Today, we're taking a look at every comic and novel based on the PlayStation series that I could find. And if you enjoyed this video, consider liking and subscribing for more. So Bloodborne fans, I know you're waiting for a sequel or a remaster of the original game, but Sony hasn't completely forgotten about Bloodborne. Since 2018, there have been 6 volumes released of a graphic novel: The Death of Sleep, The Healing Thirst, A Song of Crows, The Veil Torn Asunder, Lady of the Lanterns, and the most recent one in 2024, The Bleak Dominion. I know it's not the same as having a new game, but maybe it'll make do for now. And if you're like me and love when things are bundled, there is a slipcase set of volumes 1 through 3, and volumes 4 through 6 is set to be released in October 2025. Does anyone remember Resistance? For a time, Resistance was a big deal because this was a new franchise from Insomniac Games and was a launch title for the PlayStation 3. Resistance: The Gathering Storm is a novel that takes place 4 months after the events of Fall of Man. If anything, this book is a must-read for fans as it expands on key details of many characters. A Resistance comic set over the course of 7 issues sees a military unit infiltrating the base to stop the Chimera from getting their hands on America's first atomic bomb. Then another novel called Resistance: A Hole in the Sky is a prequel to Resistance 3. Taking place weeks after the ending of Resistance 2, it follows Joseph Capelli being dishonorably discharged from the military and now working as a hired runner. So for anyone missing the Resistance series, you might want to check these out. If we go back to 2004, Killzone debuted on the PlayStation 2 in what was dubbed by the media as Sony's Halo Killer. To go with this was a planned 3-issue comic release. However, those comics were never released. Dreamwave Productions, who were set to publish the comics, went bankrupt in 2005. Outside of covers for each issue and a summary, that's all we know of these comics. And it wouldn't be until Killzone 3 when a novel adaptation called Killzone Ascendancy was released. Then when it came to promoting Killzone Mercenary for the PlayStation Vita in a Japanese magazine called Shonen Ace, a 40-page one-shot manga simply called Killzone was featured. In 2010, Ratchet Clank had a 6-issue comic run that tied into the events of Ratchet Clank All for One. And this comic actually uses the idea of a planet-stealing villain that was meant for a crack in time. However, this didn't fit into its time-traveling tale. And one of the best parts in this comic is when Ratchet's girlfriend meets his ex. For us longtime fans, it's great seeing this PS2 character return. Ever since Horizon Zero Dawn came out, Sony has been going full force on the series, and this led into 2 volumes of a comic which both take place during the events of the game. And like Bloodborne, both volumes of Horizon are also available in a nice slipcover set. Now, as someone who's read the comics, I can't really say they add much to the larger Horizon narrative. And I think these comics are the perfect example of why an expanded universe can be so frustrating. Because unlike Horizon, the Infamous comic feels like a more crucial read. There's a bit of a gap between the original Infamous and its sequel, This comic picks up where Infamous left off. It reveals the fates of characters like Moya and other enemies Cole fought, characters that were seemingly abandoned, because as far as I recall, I don't remember them mentioning a character like her in the sequel. So anyone who is a fan of Infamous needs to read this comic. Much like Heavy Rain, Detroit Become Human arrived and blew me away. The characters, the setting, how your choices impacted the story, all of it was incredible. So I love that this universe expanded into a manga called Detroit Become Human Tokyo Stories. And if you play the game, you'll already have the basic idea of how this story goes. These 2 volumes tell the personal stories of more androids becoming deviant and finding out who they truly are. But because this takes place in Japan, androids are viewed differently than how they are in America. Like many of Kojima's projects, Death Stranding is something people either understand or they don't. On the surface, sure, call it a walking simulator, but Death Stranding is so much more than that. It's about the journey, how you get there, and the connections you make. And because there is so much lore and story to this game, it was adapted into not 1, but 2 novels. Like Eco, I would still recommend playing the game first and then reading the books. In this case, the books will probably help in understanding everything there is to the game. Now many probably don't know that Sackboy: A Big Adventure had a tie-in comic. Those who pre-ordered the game digitally were given a digital comic called The Gathering Storm. This is a prequel to A Big Adventure that focuses on the character of Scarlet, who later becomes a mentor to Sackboy. As far as I know, this was the only way to get this comic. God of War is beyond a massive franchise for Sony. Going from Greek mythology to Norse, there is a lot this series has covered. So it's maybe not so surprising that 3 of the God of War games have novel adaptations. This includes the first 2 games and the 2018 reboot, and for some reason, God of War 3 and Ragnarok were completely ignored. But while the books tread common ground, it's the comics that are a bit more interesting. The first was simply called God of War, and was released to coincide with God of War 3. This comic follows 2 narratives. Kratos in the past trying to save his dying daughter, and then another years later as he tries to prevent the resurrection of Ares. Another comic simply called God of War took place before the events of the 2018 game. Here, Kratos is trying to control his rage and put his past behind him, but finds himself entangled in battle with a cult. Sony even released this digital version of the comic onto the PlayStation Store, so if you're interested, you can buy it there. And more recently, we have a comic called God of War Fallen God, which gives us some insight to what happened to Kratos after the events of God of War 3. However, don't go into this thinking you're going to get some clear-cut answers, because Fallen God doesn't do this. Growing up, you might remember Disney Adventures magazine. In its winter 2000 issue, Ape Escape had a comic called Monkey Madness. It was only 6 pages long and was used to advertise the first game on PlayStation. For anyone who loves Insomniac Spider-Man games, so far 2 prequel novels have been released. The first takes place before the 2018 game. Spider-Man Hostile Takeover dives into the end of Peter and Mary Jane's relationship, while also showing more of the conflict between Kingpin and Spider-Man. It also sees Echo teaming up with Spider-Man, and the introduction of the villain, Blood Spider. Then we have Spider-Man Miles Morales Wings of Fury, a prequel to Spider-Man Miles Morales, which sees Miles coming to terms in what it means to be Spider-Man. It also features Vulture and Starling releasing experimental tech onto the city. And 3 different comics based on the games were released. Spider-Man City at War is an adaptation of the 2018 game. Spider-Man The Black Cat Strikes adapts the City That Never Sleeps DLC expansion, and Spider-Man Velocity is an original comic that explains why Peter built the armored Velocity suit. The beauty of the Uncharted series is that it's like Tomb Raider and Indiana Jones. There are so many adventures and stories to tell, and when Uncharted was at its peak, Sony took advantage. Around the release of Uncharted 2, a digital motion comic called Uncharted Eye of Indra released on the PlayStation 3's store. and it's a direct prequel to Drake's Fortune. This is a 4-episode story that features full voice acting from the cast and sees new and original characters returning. It would have been great to see this in the Nathan Drake collection, but it's stuck on the PlayStation 3. By the time 2011 came around and Uncharted 3 released, with it came a 6-issue comic and a novel. The comic sees Nate searching for the legendary Amber Room, and it also shows us how Nate and Chloe first met. Meanwhile, the novel Uncharted: The Fourth Labyrinth has Nate and Sully traveling the world in this adventure based on Greek mythology. Like Golden Abyss on the Vita, it's set sometime before Drake's Fortune and is a standalone story. For how massive The Last of Us has become, it's pretty shocking that it only has a 4-issue comic and that's it. This is The Last of Us American Dreams, and it's a prequel to the Left Behind DLC that's a prequel to the original Last of Us game. In American Dreams, we learn how Ellie met Riley, we see more of Ellie in the boarding school, she learns to ride a horse, and we encounter Ellie's first meeting with Marlene. Basically, this is a comic that's rewarding to read if you played Left Behind. But while The Last of Us American Dreams can easily be purchased today, the Sly Cooper comics aren't so lucky, at least if you want them physically. 2 promotional comics called The Adventures of Sly Cooper were released in 2004 and 2005. The first issue is set in between the first 2 games, while the second takes place in between the second and third game. Both of these issues are very expensive to purchase, but thankfully, both comics are available to read online. There was also a children's book called Sly Cooper to Catch a Thief, and unlike the comics, this is extremely cheap to buy. Apparently, it's based on the first issue of The Adventures of Sly Cooper, but has some changes made. This book was published in 2006, and is only 74 pages long, so it should make for an easy read. Parappa the Rapper has a comic collection called Rodney Fun Comic Collection 1. It's the only collection that was ever released, and within this is 5 different stories focusing on a specific character. And one of these stories involves an original character called Square E Bear, who has never appeared in the games nor in the anime series. MediEvil was always a series that deserved more love. After getting a sequel in 2000, we were supposed to get a third game on the PlayStation 2 called MediEvil 3 Fate's Arrow, and this game would have picked up from MediEvil 2's true ending. However, this didn't happen, and instead, we received a reimagining of the original game on the PlayStation Portable, and later in 2019, we had a PlayStation 4 remake as well. With that remake came a MediEvil graphic novel. If you buy the digital deluxe version of the game on the PlayStation Store, you will get a digital version of that graphic novel, and it's also available physically in a hardback cover. But this graphic novel is based on the third game we never saw. The plot was greatly changed, but it still follows the same overall structure of Fortescue traveling back in time before the events of the first game. And this was written by the original co-creators, so at least there is some sort of resolution, because who knows if Sony will ever touch MediEvil again. In 2010, Sony released Syphon Filter Logan's Shadow onto the PlayStation 2, and when this was announced on the PlayStation blog, with it came the announcement of Syphon Filter The Opposition Effect. This was set to be the first ever Syphon Filter digital graphic novel on the PlayStation Store. At over 120 pages long, The Opposition Effect was set between Dark Mirror and Logan's Shadow. However, it was never released and we don't know why. The comic still exists on X-Men Studio employee John Garvin's hard drive, but we'll likely never see it in its entirety, minus a few pages from this blog post. PlayStation's Forgotten Horror series Siren has had 2 manga adaptations based on the first game. The first was Siren Call of the Red Sea. After releasing 7 chapters, the series was cancelled due to the author's ill health. This was then replaced with an online-only manga called Siren Rebirth, and ran for 16 chapters. Back in 1996, Twisted Metal 2 was released on PlayStation, and a 16-page Twisted Metal 2 comic was made as a tie-in. Only 100 copies were printed. 50 of these were given out as a prize by Sony, while the other 50 were given out randomly. Because of this, this comic is extremely rare and expensive. However, fans have put all 16 pages online to be viewed. With all of these PlayStation novels and comics, which of these surprised you? What would you recommend? Let us know down in the comments. Be sure to like, share, subscribe, and ring that bell to be notified about future content. And if you enjoyed this, check out this past video on lost and forgotten PlayStation movies and TV shows. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.